The warehouse was bleeding money, and no one could tell him why. Ethan Reynolds, CEO of a mid-sized retail chain with 12 locations, had spent the past few months drowning in reports declining efficiency, missing inventory, and a surge of employee complaints. His regional managers assured him everything was under control, but the numbers told a different story. Frustrated, Ethan made a decision. He'd go undercover as a new warehouse worker. He had never met the employees at this location. Personally, his company had grown too fast for that. With a shaved beard, dyed hair, and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses, he looked nothing like the polished executive who sat in a corporate office. When he arrived at the warehouse, the manager barely looked at him. "You're the new guy? Name's Todd. Grab a vest. Don't slow us down." The place was chaotic. Forklifts beeped, metal shelves groaned under the weight of stacked boxes, and workers moved like machines, heads down, sweat dripping. Ethan struggled to keep up. The scanner in his hand felt foreign, and a younger worker, Jason, sighed in frustration. "Come on, man, we don't have all day." As he hustled to keep pace, his eyes landed on an elderly worker pushing a loaded cart. Her name tag read Martha. She had to be at least in her late 60s, her thin frame struggling under the weight of the boxes. She wiped her forehead with a trembling hand before bending down, wincing as she lifted another heavy package. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. She forced a smile. "I'm fine, dear, just gotta keep moving." Todd, the manager, barked from across the warehouse. "Martha, move faster. We're not paying you to take breaks." Ethan's stomach twisted. She wasn't taking a break. She was barely keeping herself upright. Martha gave him a small nod, then pushed forward, her steps slow but steady. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't right. Over the next few hours, he watched Martha work harder than anyone else, taking the worst tasks without complaint. He also noticed something else: Todd barely worked at all. He spent most of his time in the office, only coming out to yell at employees. When he did, it was always the older or newer workers who got the worst of it. By lunch, Ethan could barely feel his arms, but Martha was still moving, eating a small sandwich while organizing a shelf. "You don't take breaks?" he asked. She chuckled. "Can't afford to. They cut my hours last month, so I need to prove I'm still useful." Ethan felt his blood boil. She'd been here for years, and they were making her fight for her job. Then, just as lunch ended, Todd stormed out of his office. "Martha, I told you to move the pallets to the back. Why aren't they done?" Martha flinched. I was just about to." "Not good enough," Todd snapped. "Maybe it's time to think about retiring." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. He had seen enough. Ethan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He had built this company from the ground up, spent years turning it into something he could be proud of. But this was unacceptable. Martha didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just lowered her head and nodded. Todd actually smirked before turning back toward his office. Ethan wanted to grab him by the collar, shove him against the nearest shelving unit, and demand an explanation. But he couldn't, not yet. He needed to see more. So he kept his head down and worked. The warehouse was a disaster. Inventory records were a joke. Half the items in the system didn't match what was actually on the shelves. Forklifts sat unused because they were out of fuel. Employees used broken scanners, relying on handwritten lists that were barely legible. And the people, they were exhausted. Jason, the younger worker, barely spoke unless it was to snap at someone. A woman named Carla limped as she moved, wincing every time she took a step. When Ethan asked, she just muttered, "Rolled my ankle 2 weeks ago. But if I call out, I won't get my hours next week." Todd didn't care about any of it. Ethan watched as the so-called manager spent over an hour sitting in the office, scrolling through his phone. When he did come out, it was only to berate someone. By the end of the shift, Ethan's back was screaming, his hands raw from lifting heavy boxes. But Martha, she was still going. "Let me help with that," Ethan said, reaching for one of the heavier packages. She shook her head. "Oh, honey, you won't last long here if you start helping an old woman like me. Todd notices things like that." Ethan's jaw tensed. Then, as if summoned, Todd's voice rang out. "Martha, you still here, clocked out 10 minutes ago." Martha flinched, quickly pulling off her vest. I was just finishing up." Yeah, Todd waved her off. "You know we don't pay overtime, right?" Ethan had seen enough. But then, something happened that made his blood run cold. A loud crash. Everyone turned. Carla was on the floor, breathing heavily. A heavy box had fallen from the top shelf, barely missing her head. Todd groaned, "For God's sake, Carla, watch where you're going." "She didn't do anything wrong," Ethan snapped too quickly, too forcefully. For a split second, Todd's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you again?" Jason stepped forward. "He's the new guy." Todd sneered. "Well, new guy, keep your nose out of things that don't concern you." Ethan ignored him. He crouched next to Carla. "Are you okay?" She winced. I think my ankle's worse." Todd sighed dramatically. "Then go home, but don't expect to be on the schedule next week." Ethan's hands balled into fists. She needed that job, he could see it in her eyes, but Todd didn't care. Carla hesitated, then slowly pulled herself up. "I'm fine," she muttered. Todd grinned. "That's what I thought." Ethan's stomach turned. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was abuse. And tomorrow, it was going to end. Ethan barely slept that night. His mind churned with everything he had seen: the exhaustion in Martha's eyes, the way Carla had forced herself to stand despite her injury, Todd's smug indifference. It wasn't just incompetence, it was neglect. And he had let it happen. The next morning, as he walked into the warehouse, he felt a fire burning in his chest. Today was the day. He had seen enough. But first, he needed one last confirmation. The shift started like the day before: organized chaos. Jason grumbled as he scanned barcodes. Martha moved slower than usual, rubbing her shoulder. Carla wasn't there. Ethan turned to Jason. "Where's Carla?" Jason didn't even look up. She called out. Guess Todd finally got to her. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then, Todd emerged from his office, sipping a coffee like he had no care in the world. "All right, listen up," he barked. "We're behind on shipments, cause some people," he shot a pointed look at Martha, "can't keep up. So no one's leaving until everything's done. Got it?" A few groans echoed through the warehouse, but no one argued. No one ever argued. Then, it happened. Martha was lifting a box onto a high shelf. Too high. Ethan saw it before she did: the way her arms trembled, the way her knees wobbled. Then, she lost her grip. The box tumbled. She stumbled backward. Ethan lunged forward too late. She hit the ground hard. A sickening thud. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Ethan was at her side. "Martha, are you okay?" Her face was twisted in pain. I think I hurt my wrist." Todd groaned. "For God's sake, Martha, you're more trouble than you're worth." Ethan's blood boiled. Todd sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine, someone drive her to urgent care, but don't expect us to cover it, Martha. Maybe if you actually did your job." Ethan snapped. He shot to his feet, eyes blazing. "Enough." Todd blinked. "Excuse me." "Enough," Ethan repeated, voice sharp as glass. Jason and the other workers froze. the warehouse fell into an eerie silence. Then Ethan reached up and pulled off his glasses, pulled off the cheap wig. Todd's face paled. Martha's eyes widened. Jason took a step back. Ethan let the disguise drop to the ground. Then, he locked eyes with Todd. "I'm Ethan Reynolds," he said, voice steady, "CEO of this company." The warehouse exploded. Gasps, murmurs. The workers looked at each other in shock. Todd, he didn't move. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. Ethan stepped forward. "For the past 2 days, I've been working under you, watching you." His voice turned razor sharp. "And what I've seen, it's unacceptable." Todd finally found his voice. Wait, this isn't what it looks like." Ethan cut him off. "Really? Because it looks like you've been mistreating your employees. Looks like you've been ignoring safety hazards. Looks like you've been running this warehouse into the ground." Todd's forehead beaded with sweat. I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Ethan's laugh was cold. "Does protocol include forcing injured employees to work? Does protocol mean humiliating an elderly worker in front of her colleagues?" Todd stammered, I didn't." Ethan turned to Jason. "How long has this been going on?" Jason hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Since Todd took over, he cuts corners, yells at people, makes us stay late without overtime." His jaw clenched. "Carla, she didn't call out, she quit." Ethan's stomach dropped. Carla needed this job, and Todd had pushed her out. Ethan turned back to Todd. "I should fire you on the spot." Todd's face drained of color. "Wait, Mr. Reynolds." "But," Ethan continued, "I want to hear from them." He turned to the workers. "What do you think?" Silence. Then, Martha. She cradled her wrist, eyes full of quiet strength. "He doesn't deserve this job." A murmur of agreement spread through the warehouse. Jason folded his arms. "He's got to go." Another worker, a woman named Rachel, nodded. "He's the reason we're struggling." Ethan turned back to Todd. "You heard them." Todd took a shaky step back. "Please, I can fix this." Ethan's voice was final. "No, you won't be fixing anything, you're done." Todd's mouth opened, then shut. He looked around at the workers he had tormented. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out. Silence hung in the air. Then Ethan exhaled and looked at Martha. "Let's get you to a doctor." The air in the warehouse was thick with silence. No one moved, no one spoke. Todd was gone, but the damage he'd done, it still lingered in the eyes of every worker standing there, exhausted, beaten down, uncertain. Ethan took a slow breath, then turned to Martha. "Come on," he said gently. "I'll take you to urgent care myself." She blinked up at him, surprised. "Oh, honey, you don't have to." "I do," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm, "and I will." Martha hesitated, then finally nodded. He helped her to her feet. Careful not to jostle her injured wrist, the other workers watched, uncertain, as if they weren't sure whether to believe what was happening. Jason shifted awkwardly. "So, what happens now?" Ethan looked at him, then at the rest of the team. Everything was about to change. After getting Martha the medical attention she needed, a sprained wrist, not broken. Thank God Ethan didn't waste a second. The very next morning, he was back in the warehouse, but this time he wasn't undercover, he was the CEO, and everyone knew it. The workers were hesitant, unsure if they should address him, if they could trust him. So, Ethan did the one thing he knew would break the tension. He grabbed a vest and got to work. For the next few hours, he stocked shelves, moved pallets, and scanned inventory side by side with his employees. He wasn't just showing up. He was proving that he understood. that he saw them, that he wouldn't let them suffer under neglect again. Then at noon, he called a meeting. The entire warehouse staff gathered, standing in a loose semicircle. Jason, Rachel, the forklift operators, even the part-timers. Martha stood at the front, wrist wrapped, but her eyes sharp. Ethan stepped forward. "I won't waste your time," he started. "What I saw here, what I experienced, it was unacceptable." His jaw tightened. "And that's on me." A murmur ran through the crowd. Ethan nodded. "I should have seen it sooner, I should have been here sooner, but I'm here now." He took a deep breath. "And things are going to change." The workers exchanged glances, skeptical, but listening. "First," Ethan continued, "Todd is gone. Permanently, he's not coming back, ever." A ripple of relief spread through the group. "Second, Carla," his voice dipped slightly. "She should never have been put in a position where she felt she had to quit. I'm reaching out to her personally, offering her job back with back pay for the time she missed. If she wants it, it's hers." Jason's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded in approval. "Third," Ethan's voice grew firmer, "we're restructuring this warehouse. No more broken equipment, no more unsafe working conditions, no more unpaid overtime. You will be treated with respect, with fairness, with dignity." A few workers shifted, uncertain. Ethan met their eyes. "I mean it, and to prove it, I'm appointing a new warehouse manager." A silence. Then, Ethan turned to Martha. Her eyes widened. "Oh no, I'm too old for." "You're the hardest worker here," Ethan interrupted gently. "You care about this place, about these people, who better to lead it?" Martha's mouth opened, then closed, her hand trembled slightly. Jason smirked. "I'd work for her any day." A few others nodded. Martha swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." Ethan smiled. "Say yes." Tears welled in her eyes, then slowly, she nodded. A small cheer rose from the workers. Over the next few weeks, the warehouse transformed. New scanners, proper scheduling, fair wages, and most importantly, respect. Carla returned hesitant at first, but when she saw Todd was truly gone, when she saw Martha standing tall as the new manager, she smiled. Jason, he softened, without Todd breathing down his neck, without the constant pressure. He became a natural leader among the workers. Ethan visited often, not as a CEO looking down, but as someone who had been there. And every time he walked through those warehouse doors, Martha would greet him stronger than ever with a knowing smile. The company was back on track. But more importantly, its people were finally seen.